just been listening to the scrutiny on the ministry specific people, so just.
Oh, very good.
But you might like to say something.
I'm a member of the Public Accounts Committee for a colleague here is the chair of the Public Expenditure Group.
Oh, very good.
So our budget comes through us on this committee level like this, and after they spend it, goes to this committee to have a look at how they spend the public money.
Very good.
So we're just here observing how New Zealand does this in the committee stages.
Yes, very good.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here.
Can I say something to Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Hello, Aotearoa. My name is Barbara Edmonds. I'm the Labour Party finance spokesperson. My great-grandfather is from Malaita, so welcome to you all. It's really nice to see you here.
Oh, very nice.
Welcome.
Oh, welcome, Minister.
Good morning.
Welcome, Mr. Rennie. Good morning.
Very nice.
Thank you. It is 9 o'clock now, members. Members, I just wanted to 9:30 at least. I just wanted to make some introductory comments myself, just to set framework for today and the expectations. I'll endeavour to ensure that this is a constructive and quarterly 2-hour session. The Minister has generously given us 2 hours, and so we can get through a lot in 2 hours at a reasonable pace without rushing it. I will take questions off members if they are ongoingly rude. We're going to have more of a focus on relevancy and more of a focus on this financial year. I will treat any outbursts of swearing as highly disorderly and will use sanctions provided in the standing orders if it gets to that, which I'm sure it won't. I'll also ask members to refrain from chatting amongst themselves. We're getting some complaints through, as is the clerk's office, that the members of the public and even our own staffers are struggling to hear sometimes because of the chat. So I will shut that down if you're talking, because the microphones are picking you up and it's more prominent on the parliamentary TV. I'll also ask that members do not ongoingly disrupt the minister or the officials and let them answer their questions. Again, quarterly and constructive. We've got a hard finish of 11:30. I don't want to have to suspend meetings because that just digs into your time. The opposition will get 2/3 of questions, as is tradition, and we will kick off with Barbara Edmonds. But first, Minister, welcome. Congratulations on your second budget. I know you've had a very busy couple of months, at least, and we look forward to your introductory remarks in the next 2 hours.
Mr. Chair, may I just clarify, please? We will be following standing orders.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, committee members. Thank you for inviting me to the committee. At the table today, I have Ian Rennie, the Treasury Secretary, and Scrutiny Little, a man who has helped piece together more budgets than just about any other living New Zealander. If the Chair permits, I will make some introductory remarks. As set out in the Fiscal Strategy Report, the key elements of the government's fiscal strategy are to reduce core Crown expenses towards 30% of GDP, to return the headline operating balance measure to surplus, to put net core Crown debt as a percentage of GDP on a downward trajectory towards 40% and keep it below that in the longer term. Members are aware that Treasury's recommended net debt ceiling is 50% of GDP, and that has had bipartisan support. We are aiming for 40% because the ceiling should never be the target. History shows that one economic shock on its own can push debt up by 20% of GDP, and we have to allow for that. And that is precisely the point of having moderate amounts of debt, so debt can increase significantly in a crisis or a shock. But once that buffer is used, it has to be restored again. Otherwise, debt just ratchets up and up. Members will also be aware that the fiscal track, while improving in an absolute sense, has been revised downwards over several forecasts. These revisions have been driven by economic factors outside the government's control. They are factors that would have impacted whoever was sitting in the chair as the Minister of Finance at the time, including in the most recent update by the imposition of new US tariffs and the resulting global uncertainty and its impacts for international growth projections. So in the face of that, the question is, what can the government do? Well, what the government can do is control its discretionary spending in the budget, and we have done that. Since the pre-election fiscal update, our budget packages and allowance changes have improved the operating balance by 2.3 billion compared to what it otherwise would have been. The latest forecasts show core Crown expenses falling over the forecast period, reaching 30.9% of GDP by 28-29, so well on the way to our 30% target. The budget forecasts also show Obergalics gradually improving after 25-26, returning to a modest surplus of 0.2 billion by the end of the forecast period. And they show the debt curve bending down over the forecast period from going up to 46% of GDP to beginning to go down. It's instructive, I think, members to consider the choices that the government has been able to make. And we have conducted an exercise in my office to see what would have happened if we hadn't delivered the savings packages in last year's budget and this year's budget, savings which have been questioned by opposition members in many instances. Taking that exercise, in the absence of the savings packages in last year's budget and this year's budget, we would be looking at significantly larger deficits and significantly more debt. For example, in the 25-26 year, while we are currently forecasting a deficit of around 12 billion, that number would be 23.4 billion if it weren't for the government's savings drives. In that 25-26 year, whereas we're forecasting debt at 43.9%, it would be 47.7%. That effect would continue throughout the forecast period, meaning that by the 26-27 fiscal year, we would blow the debt ceiling and be at 51.7%, and it would continue to climb, going to 53.8% and then 55% in subsequent years, with the deficit position continuing into the forecast period. My point is a simple one, members, which is that New Zealand's economy, as have many economies around the world, has gone through a very challenging period. And we must respond to that, but we cannot take responsibility for all of those impacts. What we can take responsibility for are our choices, and I believe that the government has made prudent choices in light of the global economic conditions we face. Another thing that the government can do and must do is introduce growth-enhancing policies that result in a larger economy and therefore a stronger set of books and stronger living standards for New Zealanders. Those changes, in some instances, deliver immediately and in the short term. In other instances, they are required to set the foundations for better long-term productivity and growth. In this year's budget, for example, we introduced the investment boost policy, which allows New Zealand businesses to immediately deduct 20% of the cost of qualifying assets on top of depreciation. That increases after-tax returns on investment and will help lift New Zealand's capital stock, GDP and wages. And I note and acknowledge the support from members around the table for that policy. The budget also included a number of other growth-enhancing measures, not all of which are reflected yet in the Treasury forecasts. They include our changes to grow New Zealanders' KiwiSaver balances, which should increase the amount of investment available in New Zealand for New Zealand assets and financial instruments. They include our changes to introduce Invest New Zealand to attract a higher rate of overseas capital into our firms and enterprises. They include substantive and well thought through changes to our education settings to ensure that more young people, particularly those with additional learning needs, receive the support they need early in order that they can achieve and contribute more to our economy in the longer run. They include our ongoing commitment to infrastructure investment, ensuring that infrastructure funding is tied to productivity enhancing infrastructure assets. Our changes to ensure that the Crown-funded research, science and technology system is better tied to the commercial needs of our firms and industries. Ongoing work to reform the Resource Management Act to free up development. Our decision to provide additional funding to Elevate New Zealand. Collectively, these choices matter. It is the position of Treasury to be very conservative before reflecting potential growth impacts in their forecasts. However, I am optimistic and confident that by continuing this focus on growth-enhancing initiatives, we will see New Zealand's economic position recover over these next 4 years and into the future. I will leave it there and say that I am happy to take the committee's questions.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to the Honourable Barbara Edmonds.
Good morning, Minister. Just want to acknowledge Dominic Stevens and Leilani Fruit. This will probably be your last estimates hearing with us. Thank you very much for your service to the Treasury. Minister, this year's budget included a return of funding of $144 million from the Reserve Bank. Through Official Information Act requests, your office sought a meeting with the previous Reserve Bank Governor on the 5th of February, then the 7th of February, and then the 10th of February. The Reserve Bank Governor at the time, Adrian Orr, declined to meet due to the blackouts that occurred during the Monetary Committee stages. A meeting was therefore held on the 24th of February with the Reserve Bank Governor at the time, Adrian Orr, the Chairperson, Professor Neil Quigley, and the Deputy Governor at the time as well. As well as the funding for the RBNZ, the Acting Reserve Bank Governor on the 8th of May in this committee confirmed that you also discussed a review of the capital requirements. Adrian Orr also resigned on the 5th of March. In the meeting on the 24th of February, did you at all indicate to the then Governor, Adrian Orr, that the decisions on the Reserve Bank's funding could be affected by the Reserve Bank's position or review of the capital requirement rules?
No, I did not. I have previously confirmed that at that meeting there were 3 key topics which were discussed. The first was the Reserve Bank's progress on implementing recommendations following the Commerce Commission's review into banking competition and my letter of expectations to the Reserve Bank. That took up quite some time in the meeting. The second item that was discussed was the capital adequacy ratios and whether or not the Reserve Bank was seeing some of the impacts that had been predicted when they chose to increase those ratios in 2019. The third topic, discussed more briefly, was the funding review. As the member will be aware, the funding agreement between the Reserve Bank and the Minister of Finance is a discussion that occurs between the Reserve Bank Board and me, and that was covered in the meeting.
It's become apparent that Adrian Orr's resignation was because of those discussions on the 24th of February. At the time of his resignation, did you know the reasons for his resignation?
Well, the Reserve Bank Board is the employer of the Reserve Bank Governor. And so at all times, I have been, I think, appropriately careful not to insert myself into that employment relationship. I was advised on the 24th by Treasury Secretary Ian Rennie that employment discussions had commenced between the Reserve Bank Board and the Reserve Bank Governor. And while it was possible for me at the time to speculate on a number of issues which could have contributed to those discussions, I have judged it prudent not to do so, noting that the Reserve Bank Board ultimately formed an exit agreement with the Reserve Bank Governor and has been best placed to speak about that.
So you were aware of his resignation, but you're also aware of speculation. What was your speculation?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
It's one thing to link the funding of the Reserve Bank to the budget, but speculating on an employee of an independent Crown entity, I don't see how it's relevant to this inquiry.
Yeah, no.
I'm speaking to her response, which is around.
Well, let's keep it on the estimates, not on speculation about the former Reserve Bank Governor's resignation last financial year.
Funding.
Okay. Well, it's a pretty tenuous link. Let's get back to the budget.
What was your speculation?
Member Edmonds made an assumption, which is not what I said. I was informed on the 24th that employment discussions had commenced. As to the reasoning for those, it is purely the member's speculation that the cause of that was the funding agreement. As has been clarified by the Reserve Bank subsequently in Official Information Act requests, they have formed the view that disagreements between the Board and the Reserve Bank Governor and the government over the level of funding that the Reserve Bank required had contributed to those employment discussions.
Minister, are you aware of Section 171 of the Reserve Bank Act that safeguards the independence of the Reserve Bank?
Yes, I am, and I take it very seriously, which is why I have judged it is not appropriate for me to speculate on the comings and goings of the employment arrangements between the Reserve Bank Board and its governor.
So
Okay.
besides the Act, are you aware that one of the key tenets for the independence of a central bank, as supported by both the IMF and the Peterson Institute for International Economics, is that the Reserve Bank has budgetary independence from the legislature? Why does your funding agreement with the Reserve Bank have a new clause, paragraph 7, that requires a return of underspends, a clause that is not in any funding agreement between the Reserve Bank and Grant Robertson, Bill English or Michael Cullen? Therefore, effectively, your 5-year funding agreement is actually an annual funding agreement.
Well, I reject the member's characterisation. It has been a long-standing feature of New Zealand's Reserve Bank framework that funding for the Reserve Bank is negotiated between the Finance Minister and the Board. This is common sense in the sense that the government ultimately needs to take control of its own fiscal strategy and needs to ensure that the funding it provides to the Reserve Bank is sufficient to carry out its statutory functions, but beyond that has discretionary choices about the level of funding. I sought throughout the funding agreement discussions to ensure that we had a clear view that the funding being provided was sufficient for the Reserve Bank to carry out its statutory functions. I became aware during those discussions that the Reserve Bank had engaged in a practice where it was bringing forward underspends, which had the effect of ramping up its effective budget out of line with the funding agreements that had been set. I have been given confidence by both the Reserve Bank Board and the Treasury that the level of funding we have provided is sufficient for the Reserve Bank to carry out its statutory functions. In fact, the Treasury advised me that we could agree to a lesser amount of funding and be satisfied that those functions could be carried out. However, I listened to the submissions from the Reserve Bank Board, who were of the view that the level of funding that we eventually struck was appropriate and would give them greater confidence in their ability to carry it out in functions.
So why are you the
Okay,
only
last supplementary,
finance-
and then we're going to move on to close.
Why are you the only finance minister who has ever had this particular clause, which effectively makes a 5-year funding agreement a 1-year funding agreement? Because I'm pretty sure Grant Robertson, Bill English, Michael Cullen would have the same views around efficiencies. However, you are the only finance minister that has that clause.
Well, that doesn't reflect my understanding. I think that there was actually not necessarily a view that the Reserve Bank was able to carry over funding beyond what had been agreed to in the 5-year funding agreement. Perhaps I'll ask Ian Rennie, the Treasury Secretary.
I've got all the agreements here.
Okay,
I will ask the
we'll
Treasury
ask
Secretary
Mr.
to address this point.
Mr. Rennie to
because,
respond, and then we're going to move to the next question.
I think that the way it's been characterised by the member doesn't reflect necessarily the facts of the case.
Thank you. If you can clarify that,
So
Mr. Rennie.
I think there's a couple of points. One is to come back to actually this, the agreement between the minister and the board is with the full agreement of the board. And the board has at no
It's
stage
not unusual.
given advice that they are unhappy about this provision. I think the second point is in the course of very lengthy discussions with the Reserve Bank around the funding agreement, there were advice sought by both the Treasury and the Reserve Bank about this issue of can you carry forward underspends, etc. And that legal advice was somewhat unclear. And that's why the position was made clear in this funding agreement. And it was, and that was something that the Reserve Bank sought clarity of through our engagements.
Which is to say that it's not actually clear that the Reserve Bank were ever able to carry forward underspends in the way that they did, per the law as it stood. That had become their practice over the past 5 years, but there was dispute as to whether or not they were legally able to do that. So we sought to clarify that in the terms of the agreement going forward.
Okay, very good. I'm going to go to.
If there's one more question.
Well,
I'm happy to-
we've
We've
had
got
7,
2 hours.
but
so may
anyway,
as well.
one more.
So do you accept any responsibility at all for the resignation of the Reserve Bank Governor, Adrian Orr?
No, the Reserve Bank Governor is responsible
She's
for his
more than
own
happy to
resignation.
answer.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay.
Again, let's get on to the 25, 26 estimates. I'm going to go to close.
Completely agrees.
So, Minister, you've spoken quite a lot about our levels of public debt. I'm interested in the correlation to private debt in particular. So I guess just as a starter for 10, could you tell us what the level of private or household debt is currently in this country?
I don't have that number to hand, but of course, we know what the contributors are to private debt. On the one hand, what is critically important is that incomes are able to keep up with prices. We have been through a period in New Zealand history in which inflation has far exceeded wage increases, with the impact that people's real wage position across many households reduced. And that, of course, can lead to debt accumulation. There are also choices which individual households and families make about the level of savings that they maintain. But a key contributor to private debt in New Zealand, which I know you are conscious of, is housing affordability. And what we know in New Zealand is that we have been through a period in history when house price increases have been significant and have outpaced wage growth, meaning that many households have had to take on more debt in order to have housing security. And I will never forget the year in which you and I sat as opposition members around this table, in which house prices increased 30% in 1 year under a Labour government. In terms of contribution to debt positions, that was very significant.
Okay. I'd really appreciate quick back and forth if we're able to do that, noting that there's obviously a lot to unpack in all of these. But just to be really clear for the record, household debt as a percentage of household nominal disposable income at December 2024 was 169%. Can you tell me your understanding of the differential between the kind of cost of debt servicing for a household versus for the government?
Well, debt servicing, of course, has a very real cost. In the case of the government, the interest bill on New Zealand's debt will be rising from 9 to more than 12 billion over the forecast period. $9 billion is a difficult figure to conceive. So to give you a sense of it, that would be enough to fund the annual operating costs of the following functions combined: the New Zealand Police Force, the New Zealand Defence Force, the New Zealand Customs Service, the entire New Zealand Prison Service, and the entire Ministry of Justice. So that interest bill is significant, and there is an opportunity cost for each of those dollars, which would otherwise have been able to be invested in public services.
So to answer my own question, household debt servicing was 10.3% of households' disposable income, which is 5 times higher than government debt servicing. Do you accept that debt servicing costs for government is 5 times lower, therefore, than it is for private households?
I think that the member should bear in mind that one of the things that New Zealanders look to the government for is a sense of security that were there to be a significant economic shock, be that a major climatic event, a biosecurity incursion, a significant earthquake, they would want the government to be in a position where it could undertake borrowing that households may not be able to undertake in order to buffer against shocks. We have seen that following the Christchurch earthquake, with the wage protections that were put in place. We saw that during COVID with the wage and business support payments that were put in place. So to some extent, I think it is the expectation of New Zealand households that the government maintain prudent enough levels of debt that it can be there on the rainy day. And I think that that balance is appropriate.
What do you think it says about debt in general, the fact that Standard & Poor's increased or upgraded our credit rating during COVID-19 when we increased debt by 20%?
Well, I think that that reflects the fact that countries around the world were in difficult positions at that time. But I would note that we simply cannot take our credit rating for granted. There are 2 observable factors which credit rating agencies are watching very closely in New Zealand's case. The first is the historic size of our current account deficit, and the second is our ongoing deficit and debt positions, which have slipped successively in recent years. And that rating matters not just to us because of our debt servicing costs and therefore our ability to borrow globally, but also the run-on effect it has for every New Zealander with debt, who will find that their interest bill is higher if there is a credit rating downgrade. So the government's decisions on its management of its own fiscal position have real and material effects for New Zealanders. I do empathise with the member's concern, which is that New Zealanders who are carrying high levels of debt face a financial burden. The question is, how does the government best address that? And it is my philosophical view that the best way that we address that is create the economic conditions in which New Zealanders can have more secure jobs, can face greater wage increases, are in an environment of stable inflation, are in an environment where interest rates aren't so high that their debt servicing becomes unbearable. And all of those factors go to good economic management. And overwhelmingly, it is countries that are wealthier, it is countries that have grown faster, that are better able to provide the choices and opportunities for individuals and households that allow them to have more comfortable debt positions.
And indeed, what much of the international commentary will tell us is that our structural deficit comes from our tax distortions, and also the point that SNP has made about that upgrade was to do with the credibility, predictability and transparency of government spending plans. So I guess the counterfactual then, why do you believe that Standard & Poor's downgraded our councils in terms of their credit ratings in March? What did they tell us?
The commentary, which I don't have to hand, as I recall, reflected the fact that they had concerns about the ways that some of our councils are managing their debt position, are making choices about their investments and their deficit positions.
What they told us was that it was the revocation of the government's Three Waters program and the fact that our councils do not have the revenue necessary to meet their mandate. But I guess I just wanted to get to the core point, which is that, do you understand?
I don't accept that assertion, by the way.
Okay, well, that is what Standard & Poor's said in their own reporting. So do you understand that investment in our infrastructure in particular and in our public sector capacity can improve our resilience and reduce the impact of entirely predictable shocks, whether they be, for example, environmental shocks or otherwise?
Yes, I do, which is why the government is committed to ongoing infrastructure investment and resilience and productivity enhancing investments. I would also point out the corollary, which that member tends to forget, which is that every dollar of infrastructure investment that the government makes is ultimately, and I'll just finish my answer if I can, Mr. Chair,
Please.
Is ultimately funded by taxpayers. Taxpayers pay us either today, providing tax to the government that would otherwise be their own income, or taxpayers tomorrow who are required to pay off debt when it becomes unmanageable. Now, if we were to tax New Zealanders more, and I recognise that that is the member's position, I believe she wishes to add $44 billion worth of taxes to New Zealanders.
New Zealanders pay less
the
income
impact
tax.
of that for individual New Zealanders would be to reduce their financial choices, resilience and security. More to the point, I believe putting that level of additional tax on our economy at this moment in our economic recovery would put that recovery at risk, therefore jeopardising the jobs and incomes of every working Kiwi.
Are you familiar with this IMF report that came out last week on our productivity challenges?
I have not reviewed that report as yet.
If I were to tell you that what was identified by the International Monetary Fund with regard to our real structural challenges around productivity are to do with capital misallocation, that is that we are seeing a lot of our money currently being invested in real estate, in our infrastructure deficits and in low innovation, particularly as a result of a lack of government investment in R&D and in research. Would that resonate with your understanding of the world and our productivity challenges?
I think you've seen in our recent budget this government's tenacious willingness to address the fact that New Zealand needs greater rates of capital intensity and productivity enhancing investments in our firms. That is precisely why we introduced the investment boost policy to provide a genuine tax incentive for firms to make investments in capital, which will enhance their ability to be more productive and to grow faster. It is also why we have identified, as have several IMF and OECD reports, that one of the factors leading to New Zealand's low rates of capital intensity is the fact that we have a very restrictive set of rules when it comes to foreign direct investment, and in fact, very low rates of foreign direct investment when compared to other countries that we like to compare ourselves with. It is simply the case that countries that better allow foreign capital to flow into their firms and productive sectors are better able to reach the levels of capital intensity that lead to greater productivity and wage growth. So that is why the government is both reforming the Overseas Investment Act and introducing Invest New Zealand to ensure that we are better able to capture cash from around the world looking for a home, because if that cash can help create better New Zealand jobs and better New Zealand incomes, We should be rolling out the welcome mat, not putting out the stop sign.
May
Okay,
I-
last supplementary.
May I
we'll
ask
move on.
why you choose to cherry pick and overblow one particular variable with regard to, for example, the access to international capital, when the IMF, the OECD, and a range of international players have consistently pointed out that the biggest barrier to productive investment in this country is our tax distortions, which see money flowing into housing?
I disagree with the member's characterisation, and I could equally accuse you of cherry picking. The most recent OECD report on the New Zealand economy was very clear about two things that we should be doing right now. One, undertaking fiscal consolidation in the face of deteriorating books and
Which we can do from a
significant
revenue side.
Just let the
demographic
minister answer.
challenges. And two, focusing on productivity enhancing and growth enhancing reform. That is exactly what the government is doing, and I'm happy with the economic choices we are making.
Okay,
Strongly
thank you.
disagree with that.
Thank
but-
you. I'll go to our Deputy Chair, Ryan Hamilton.
Thanks, Chair. Just one primary and possibly a sup on that. Minister, savings and reprioritisation was again a big feature of this budget. Can you elaborate how you'll continue to look for savings over the budget and forecast period?
Yeah, well, look, I'm really proud of the collective efforts of our ministers to continuously drive for value for money. We are conscious that every dollar we spend is spent on behalf of New Zealand taxpayers. And the question I think all of us should ask before we spend another dollar is, what difference would that dollar have made in a family whose budget is stretched each week, who at the supermarket aisle are having to make very difficult choices about which food they purchase for their kids' lunch boxes? And so we have had a continuous savings drive, both to identify areas of spending which are no longer driving the gains that were hoped for, but also to make sure that funding can flow to its highest priority uses. Now, granted, there will be different value judgments about those. We in this budget put $420 million into the police. Others around this table would defund the police. We stand by that choice.
We're actively defunding
Our
the police.
savings initiatives delivered in our first budget $23 billion worth of savings over the forecast period. In this budget, $21 billion worth of savings over the forecast period. The simple reality for anyone wanting to manage New Zealand's finances over the next few years is that we can't simply rain more money into every budget. We always need to be looking for savings to top up the discretionary investments that we make elsewhere.
Very good.
And just a supplementary on that, as you work through some of the, I guess, the legacy financial issues that have been enshrined, were there any surprises where there were investments made over time that didn't deliver outcomes?
Yes, that has been a feature of our journeys of discovery through the government books, that there have been a number of areas which we have identified where we haven't seen the bang for buck that we think New Zealand taxpayers would expect. And ministers have been forthcoming in bringing forward savings. In other cases, we have seen the opportunity to make policy changes, which in the long run will have positive fiscal effects, but we also think positive economic and social effects. An example of that is our initiative in this year's budget, where we've identified that while 18 and 19-year-olds have every opportunity to enter education or training that is subsidised by the taxpayer, increasingly we are seeing a number of them choose to be on the job seeker benefit. That is bad for them. The stats are pretty clear that if you end up on a job seeker benefit at that age, the chances are you will be on that benefit for many years into the future, which is a terrible undermining of human potential. So in this budget, we have introduced savings by saying that in future, 18 and 19-year-olds will have eligibility for a job seeker benefit tested against parental income. The intent of the policy is very clear. It is to say we want those young people either in a job or in training. And that is the best place for them. The corollary is also a fiscal saving.
Okay, thank you. We've got one supplementary from Chloe Swarbrick, and then we're going to go to Dr. Deborah Russell.
Yeah, primarily springboarding off of your answer to that primary question in which you conflated effectively a government with a household. I just wanted to understand your understanding of the multiplier effect of government spending.
Well, that depends on the quality of government spending, and it is wrong to assume that every time that the government spends a dollar that creates positive impact,
Such as on tax
because
cuts.
there is always an opportunity cost, as I've just outlined, which is that you then need to consider, would the dollar spent through government consumption create more positive impact than a dollar spent through private consumption? And certainly when you look through the books over recent years, the shift in New Zealand has been increasing amounts of our overall economic resource being tied up by the state, with higher rates of government spending proportional to our economy. That has coincided with decreasing rates of productivity by the state, which is to say that the impact it has had from the spending it has made has been low. And anecdotally, members will have heard this from members of the public who say, well, I know that we racked up more than $120 billion of extra debt under the last government. I know that spending blew out, but what do we have to show for it? And so we are always conscious in this government that when the private sector has more resources, it can make good discretionary choices about where to invest and how to spend that in many cases can be productivity and growth enhancing.
Okay, we're going to leave it at that. We're going to go to the Honourable Dr. Deborah Russell. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, I want to focus my questions around the cost of living and working for families and family boosts and so on. So that's the general area where I've got a set of questions. Stats New Zealand had some price indices come out yesterday with inflation figures, and you see that food prices are up by about 4.4% the May to May year, so that takes out the seasonality. Beef's up 16.2%, lamb up 20.3%, rent's up 2.8%, cheese and milk are up 17.3% and 13.7%, electricity's up 8.7%. Look, the reason I'm going through these figures is that they are the figures that affect many of our working families. And particularly people who are renting and so on. So there's a cost of living issue there. And of course, you frequently said you're laser focused on the cost of living. Can you tell me what specific measures you have in the budget to address the cost of living?
Well, absolutely focused on the cost of living, and delighted that those numbers are far smaller than they were during your time as a minister, when inflation generally and food price inflation in particular was a lot higher than it is now. I also note that the member didn't mention a statistic which I certainly welcomed in that release yesterday, which is that the rate of rent increases is now the lowest it has been since 2011.
Wow.
People
So
are
in
leaving.
more
191
than
people are leaving a
And that
day.
is,
Okay, order.
it is of
Order.
course relevant to the member's question because she specifically said what impact does this have for renters.
So what specific
And
measures in the budget?
If I could finish
Yes,
my answer, Mr.
yep,
Chair.
please let the minister
that
answer.
would be helpful. And we are conscious very much that rent is a significant proportion of people's costs, that rents had ramped up significantly under the last budget, and we have taken intentional policy choices intended to put downward pressure on rents. So it is positive to see that those statistics are turning the other way. I've long said that I aspire to a situation
just let the minister finish and then we'll
where
come back.
landlords
Order.
are competing for tenants rather than the other way around. In terms of food price inflation, as I said, those rates of increase are lower than they have been. To some extent, when you talk about, for example, the meat price, that does reflect higher global commodity prices, and New Zealand does see those prices reflected in our prices. The question is, what can the government do? There
I
are
asked for
three
specific
key
measures
there
in
are
the
three
budget.
Hang on, just let the minister out, and you've got plenty more questions, Dr. Russell.
I am
Order.
about to address that question, Deborah. The first thing is, overall impact on inflation is significant to all prices that Stats NZ monitor. And I am proud of the fact that our government has made deliberate choices to rein in spending significantly, the lowest operating allowance in more than a decade, whereas the last government exceeded all of its operating allowances, reining back government spending so that inflation has been able to stabilise. This has allowed also the Reserve Bank to reduce interest rates. That set of fiscal choices is easily ignored. And we had a period in economic history
Point of order, Mr.
where
Chair.
governments
Point of
pretended
order.
that the
Dr.
way that
Deborah
they
Russell.
address
So
the
thank
cost
you,
of
Mr.
living.
Yep.
Mr. Chair, I appreciate that the minister wants to outlay some background. She spent 3 minutes now without getting to, I asked that what specific measures in this budget
Okay.
address the cost of living.
That's all right.
The background?
Yep.
But if the minister
Yeah,
could answer.
and Dr. Russell, I want you to know that you'll get up to 8 questions like your colleagues have too, so we will get there.
Well, just a moment, Mr. Chair. It's not just a matter of the number of questions, it's the amount of time the minister
That's
spends
right.
giving us information that she feels is necessary,
Okay.
but I don't to the specific.
Okay, well, can you repeat your specific question and we'll have another go?
What specific measures in this budget address the cost of living for working families?
We have, Mr. Chair, uncovered a significant philosophical difference, and I wish to highlight it before commenting on a number of other matters. That is, if it is the view of members that the only way that a government addresses the cost of living is through spending additional money, then we have uncovered the heart of the problem that occurred over the past 6 years, which is that governments that lose sight of the fact that their overall spending choices contribute to inflation and therefore the cost of living leads to a situation in which we had 7.3% annual inflation, 3 years of inflation out of band. My point is this. We cannot keep our eye off the ball of the underlying fundamentals that we put in place in the economy through our fiscal choices. To the second point of your question, which is which specific initiatives? No, we did not introduce a cost of living payment for dead people and French backpackers. Instead, what we did was we made adjustments to working for families, which mean that those families on the lowest and middle incomes will receive a small increase, a modest increase in the support that they receive additional to their existing entitlements. We also ensured that we have created more funding to make sure that food support services and other welfare support services continue to be available. We've made adjustments to accommodation supplement boundaries so that more people are eligible for accommodation supplements in some regions of New Zealand. We made changes to the prescription period so that those families who often have high living costs as a result of high health needs in their family need to make less frequent visits to the GP and are able to have longer term prescriptions. There were a number of specific initiatives, but my point is an important one, which is if governments pretend that the only way they address the cost of living is through spending more taxpayers' money, they are taking their eye off the ball. And second is this, that member voted against tax relief changes, which mean that every family that has a taxpayer in it is now better off in terms of raw dollars in their bank account than they would otherwise be. And we have maintained those tax reductions in this budget. You oppose them, people would have less money in their bank accounts if you were in charge.
Okay. No, I'm sorry, you're not chairing this. I'm going to go to a supplementary from Dan Bidwar, and then I'm going to go to Barbara Edmonds, and then we're going to come back to you. Sorry, Mr.
Excuse me, point of order, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Point of order. So the point of order is, because of Scrutiny Week, committee members are allowed a sustained line of questioning. The member has only had one primary question. She has not had any supplementary questions due to the comments by the minister taking a number of minutes. So therefore, it'd be unfair to the member if she's unable to continue a sustained line of questioning.
I was always going to come back to her, as I said, but
she's only had one primary.
Mr. Bidwar is happy to defer his supplementary, and so we'll continue.
So if I may, Mr. Chair, given that the minister took 5 minutes of commentary to answer 30 seconds of, give me 30 seconds on the direct measures.
Was it 5 minutes?
It was. So I do just want to be very focused on this. And if the minister could answer the question without, with a little commentary, fine, but not, 5 minutes. Going back to the working for families.
Shall we do a deal? Let's do a deal. Shorter questions, shorter answers.
Going back to the working for family, for families question, you said you had introduced a small amount of relief from working for families. How much was that?
It varies depending on families, but up to $17 a fortnight. And I would just like to highlight for members that these are additional to the changes that happen as a consequence of the automatic adjustments in law. They're not actually changes that any of the governing parties campaigned on. However, we made a discretionary policy choice that when it comes to the cost of living, those people who are most impacted are those households with low incomes, with high costs due to children and dependents, and that this discretionary choice meant that they were better off than they would otherwise be, and we stand by that choice.
So, Minister, the particular change you're referring to is a change to the abatement thresholds. And you said $17 a fortnight, so about $7 or $8 a week.
On average, but it depends.
Sure,
and
of course
I can certainly furnish an answer which goes through the
I
detail
don't need
of that.
the commentary here, thank you. What I need to know is when does that change kick in from?
I don't have that date to hand. Can someone from the Treasury help out?
So you trumpet it in your budget.
Yeah, I think from 1 April next year.
Right, so this change of up to $17 a fortnight or $7 a week on average, which varies across families, doesn't kick in until 1 April next year.
Well, that's because of the changes to the way that the changes to the tax system work. I don't think there's
So in
anything
fact,
unusual
there's
about
no
that.
immediate cost of living relief for working for families from this current budget.
Well, every family who is eligible for Working for Families will continue to receive their Working for Family payments within their eligibility over the next few months. That will continue to be the case as a top up to their wages and family income. And the rate of that top up will increase as a consequence of the budget's changes.
So, Minister, you were able to deliver partial expensing for businesses and what was the other one? The landlord things, the decreases to the amount of interest that landlords paid pretty much straight away, but you're not able to deliver relief for working families until 1 April next year.
Look, I don't accept the inference of the member's question, which is to say that we have ensured that we are making those changes to the Working for Families system so that going forward people will get more than they otherwise would, while still ensuring that they have all of their existing entitlements to those in-work tax credits and other supplements. However, it is also the case that there is a question about when should the investment boost policy apply, and the member is knowledgeable about tax matters and would understand that if we had said we were delaying the introduction of the investment boost policy, a very clear impact would have resulted, Mr. Chair, which is which business in its good
Just
mind,
let the minister
in
answer,
its own
please.
mind,
Let the minister
would have-
answer. Order.
which business in sound mind would have made an investment now, knowing that they would, if they delayed the investment until later, would get a tax credit for it, but
Because
making
it's
the investment
annual.
now wouldn't. And in fact, one of
Annual
the
assessment.
impacts that we were seeking to have was to boost investment at a time when
Well,
there is
with
significant
respect-
investment uncertainty. So I think
Okay.
that was sound decision making.
Well, with
Okay, another
respect,
question,
Minister,
Dr.
as you
Russell.
say, I am knowledgeable about tax.
Well, so you don't know
So,
about interest deductibility.
And in particular, around there was no reason why this change for Working for Families couldn't have kicked in by say 1 October this year. Might have been hard to deliver, but it would have been done. Why the choice to delay it until 1 April next year?
Look, I'd have to go back and review the advice that I received from the Inland Revenue Department on that matter. What we sought to do was address the fact that we were conscious that there were lower and middle income families in need of relief. We sought to do that in a way that was fiscally neutral, and we sought to do that in a way that was achievable within Inland Revenue's operational constraints and within our own legislative constraints. And there was no fiscal decision to delay it. It was simply a matter of when we could operationalise it. But as I say, I'm happy to go back and get the member more information about that timing.
So, Minister, the other thing that seems to have been difficult to operationalise has been the family boost policy. Do you know yet how many families have actually received the full $250 that was promised by the National Party at the election in terms of the family boost?
What the $250 that the member refers to comprises of two.
As well.
If I can just answer the question,
please,
Mr. Chair,
Please.
was we looked at two things. One, what would the maximum impact be on a household in terms of the tax relief package that we introduced, which was a combination of bracket changes and increases to family tax credits. And then we looked at what was the maximum amount that someone could receive under the family boost scheme. And we combined that to say that notionally that was the most that someone could receive on a fortnightly basis under our tax plan. And I'm proud of the fact, members, that we delivered all of the elements, every single piece of the policy that informed that modelling. And we ensured that we kept those commitments despite the state of the books left to us by the last government, such that we have delivered on those promises. To the second part of the member's question, in terms of how many families will have met both the criteria for the maximum amount of bracket relief and family tax credit, that combines two pieces of information. First, income related tax changes, which are individual. Second, household related tax credit eligibility, which is a household factor. Those are two separate things to combine. Circumstances vary both in terms of within a year and over a period of time. Then there is the question
The minister can finish the answer and then we'll give you another
what level
question.
of family boost repayment people are eligible. And those two things need to be combined. It is significant that family boost repayments can be claimed up to 4 years after costs are incurred. What that means is that we are not able to be clear about how many people have received the full entitlement until a full 4 years afterwards. We made that choice because we do not want New Zealanders to feel that they've missed out
That's right.
on that entitlement because they didn't have time to file
Okay.
their
So the
claim.
minister
Okay, Dr.
seriously
Russell,
accepts-
we're winding up on your
I've got
questions
just two
now.
more points. So the minister seriously accepts that time poor working families will 4 years after the event have kept the receipts so that they can claim the family boost.
Well, IRD's advice to us was that by keeping it open in that way, we would make sure that we had maximum uptake.
Okay, so is the minister proud? Is the minister proud that so far a maximum of 384 families, instead of the 100,000, so a maximum of 384 families have been able to claim the full amount that was promised to them in budget 24? Are you proud of that, Minister?
Well, as the member is aware, I have been seeking advice from the Inland Revenue Department about what changes we could make to the scheme to ensure that more families are eligible for more under Family Boost. The government has never previously collected the information, the rich data we now have, which gives us a better sense of the connection between people's household income and how much they're spending on early childhood education. What we have uncovered is that those on higher incomes are more likely to be paying higher fees. And in some senses, this will just make sense to members, which is families where children are attending many hours of early childhood education tend to have 2 full-time workers and therefore have higher household income. Families when one caregiver is at home tend to have lower income and therefore, but also lower early childhood fees because their children aren't attending ECE for as long. That pattern of fee correlation to household income is very different from what the IRD assumed in their modelling, which has meant that some of their estimates of uptake have turned out to be lower than they had estimated. And so we are looking at what are our options for expanding the reach of that scheme, and Cabinet will come to decisions on that shortly.
Okay, thank you. We've got a supplementary by the Honourable Barbara Edmonds, and then we're going to go to a primary by the Honourable, we'll go to your primary supplementary after that, Dr. Woods. Barbara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, you claimed both in the media and today that you didn't campaign on making that abatement threshold change. Is that correct?
Well, in our initial tax policy, we did campaign on an abatement change. In our coalition agreements with New Zealand First and ACT, we agreed not to go ahead with it. And then the specific changes that we made were not changes that we had promised or promoted in the lead up to the budget.
So you are confirming today that the National Party policy of adjusting the abatement threshold for working for family payments up to $50,000 from 1 April 2026 will no longer happen?
That's not a revelation. In the days and weeks following the election outcome, we were very clear that that change would not be progressing, and that has been well traversed.
So broken promise.
Okay.
No, a coalition compromise. And the member will be aware that when the $88 billion worth of Greens debt wants to be added to your pile and the $44 billion of extra tax
Okay.
wants to be added
Right,
to
we're
your
going to
pile,
order.
you'll be making a few compromises too.
Order, thank you. We're going to go for a sup from the Honourable Dr. Megan.
Who wants the green budget? I'll do it.
Well, at least you've got one.
Dr.
Chloe.
Woods. Dr. Woods.
Thank you, Minister. You've said that we may have to wait 4 years to find out if there is a single family in New Zealand that has received the $250 that was promised by the National Party and promised in last year's budget.
As I said, we've delivered on all of our
Sorry,
promises
no,
in relation to
Minister,
that tax policy.
I'm asking you a straight question. It would be good if I could ask that question. What advice have you received, if any, around around what the likely number of the people receiving the full $250?
As I say, it's very difficult for IRD to model that, and it is an important point that I'm making, so I'll make it again. The $250
Minister,
that we
we
modelled
don't need
was the
Mr. Chair.
potential
Mr. Chair.
outcome.
No.
Was based on us delivering the parameters of a tax policy, which we have delivered in full. We have kept our promise. Was based on us delivering a family boost policy, the eligibility thresholds and requirements of which we have kept in full. So I reject the conclusion of the member's question that any commitment has been broken. It has not been.
Minister.
And I'll tell you what,
Minister, the question simply is, what you're claiming that you've kept every promise. You cannot come up with a single family in New Zealand that has received the $250. I want to know what advice you have received to monitor how this is being rolled out. Until you can tell us that there is a single family in New Zealand that has received the $250, isn't it time that you just admit you misled New Zealanders?
well, I completely reject the characterisation of the member's question, and I would make 2 points. The first is the one that I already explained somewhat laboriously, which is that there is a difference between people's income as an individual taxpayer and therefore the effect tax relief has on them as an individual worker, and the supports that they are eligible for based on household income. Drawing those two things together has innate complexity in terms of IRD's ability to give us detailed information about people's tax circumstances. For example, self-employed people often don't file their tax returns, and therefore we don't know their overall tax position for some period subsequent to the year in which the tax changes were introduced. The second point I'd make, Mr. Chair, briefly is this.
Zero.
There are millions of New Zealand households who benefited from tax relief that this government delivered that the members opposite opposed. So every time they cry about how much tax relief people have received from our budgets, I cry wolf, because actually what they wanted was for those families to get zero in tax relief. That is the contrast between our two positions.
Any supplementaries, Dr. Woods?
Yes, this is just a sup on that question. Will them, and I appreciate the Minister may not have it at her fingertips now, but I think it would be useful if the Minister could supply to the committee any advice that she has received around how many people are receiving the full $250 amount, because we would like to see if there is a single family in New Zealand that has received the full amount of $250.
As I've said to the member, I have received advice.
So would you supply that to the committee?
Yes,
You know,
let the
if
Minister
I could
answer.
finish my answer, that would be helpful. I have received advice on how many families we think have benefited from changes to tax brackets, which she opposed. I have received advice on how many families have received increases in tax credits, which she opposed. I have received advice on how many families have received family booster payments, which she opposed. But collectively, drawing those together is challenging for the IRD.
Okay, we're going to, thank you, Dr. Woods. We're going to go to Todd Stevenson for a primary.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to move on from the last election because the result was pretty clear to me. I just want to talk about estimates and just looking here in some of your opening comments, actually, in vote finance, a significant amount of the appropriation
Come
for
back to
finance
primary.
goes to servicing debt, around 80%. And I think in your opening comments, you actually mentioned the idea of having a debt ceiling of 50% moving to 40%. Going forward, have you given consideration to other settings where, you know, say a debt ceiling could be over 100% or 120%, and what that could do to New Zealand economy and the vision for New Zealand and taxpayers?
Look, I am aware of those who believe that we should have a huge spending party today and leave our kids to clean up the mess. I reject that view. That has consequences both in the immediate term, because debt accumulation has a couple of immediate costs for an economy. The first is in terms of debt servicing, money that then is spent on an interest bill, often to people we are borrowing from offshore, but also in terms of the credit ratings that New Zealand is able to achieve and therefore the rate at which New Zealanders are able to borrow. In the more medium term, an economy that is weighed down by that level of debt faces a very significant crisis point when it then needs to extend that borrowing to respond to a shock or crisis, because it may be news to some around this table, but the world doesn't owe us a living. There is no UN requirement that when New Zealand wants to borrow money, someone has to lend. What we need to demonstrate to the world is that we are worthy of credit, that we are able to pay our bills. And if we were to exceed our debt ceiling significantly, we could put ourselves in a position where a future generation would be faced with real austerity. That is, having to cut actual levels of spending in order to keep an economy afloat. And I think it would be irresponsible for this government to put New Zealand in that position.
Just as a sup on that.
Yeah, we've got a, if you've got a
One
sub,
quick
we'll
sup,
come to you.
yeah.
Well, I
Ms.
mean,
Swarbrook.
it did allude specifically to.
No, it's all right.
Greenhouse
We've,
fiscal
the opposition had a view on me interrupting a primary before, so we're going to go
One
continue
quick
with
more
Todd.
sub. Obviously tied to this too is, and you mentioned in your opening comments, obviously there's, government debt and the track for that, but obviously also government deficit. I think you mentioned, obviously over 25, 26, we've got about 12 billion. But you also did look at other options that if the government actually hadn't consolidated its fiscal position and made changes, I think you said it could be looking at 23.4 bids. Again, I'm just really interested in your thinking about obviously going through all of the government spending and actually trying to consolidate it and actually changing that deficit track.
Yeah, well, look, obviously, there isn't a day I wake up where I don't think of the many areas that New Zealanders would wish to see the government be able to afford to invest in. And any finance minister faces choices about which investments they can and can't make. But in a discretionary way, when we make decisions to be more disciplined at the margin, that cumulatively adds up to much healthier books. So just to take you back to those numbers, if we had not made the savings we made in last year's budget, which was a deliberate choice that we made, and if we had not made the savings we delivered in this year's budget, then very quickly our fiscal position would have deteriorated significantly, such that in the coming fiscal year, the deficit would be $23.4 billion versus the $12 billion that we are instead achieving. And very quickly, by the end of the forecast period, instead of the debt curve curving down to 46%, we would find ourselves over the ceiling at 53.8%. My point is discretionary decisions to put a stitch in time now add up over the medium to long term. And by applying that discipline, we put the New Zealand economy in a much stronger position to provide better choices for future governments and for future generations.
You're done, Mr. Stevenson. We're going to go to supplementary from
Yeah,
Chloe
just to
Swarbrook and then
piggyback off
Dr.
of,
Megan Woods.
your comments before, what sounds more like that so-called spending party that you alluded to, planned, credible investment in our infrastructure that we borrow for, which increases our resilience, or borrowing for tax cuts as you did?
Well, unfortunately, we only have recent history to go by, and I would rather judge by results than notions of a newfound commitment to fiscal restraint and credibility. Over the past 6 years, when the last Labor government went on a spending party of levels quite outside what had occurred in our other economic history, the result of that was pretty clear. More than $120 billion of extra debt, very little productive infrastructure assets to show for it, a significant spike in inflation and interest rates, a strangling of genuine real economic activity. And for many New Zealanders, they were left at the end of that period worse off, not better off. So it's easy to talk about making careful fiscal choices, but the evidence is that when Labor Green governments are given the checkbook, they do not make wise choices.
If I may.
Okay, you can have one more sup, and then we're going to go to Todd for a sup, and then sustain from Dr. Woods.
Sorry.
You need to impose some order on this committee.
I do, however, just respectfully, Minister, want to ask there, because in a number of your questions, you yourself have disaggregated the spending that was necessary over COVID in order to respond to that shock, which in our back and forth, you have admitted and accepted that Standard & Poor's upgraded our credit rating as a result of the credibility of that spending plan. You recognise...
I don't think that that's what happened, but okay.
Okay, but you accept that the response to COVID was something which is quite different from the proposal which the Greens have on the table, given that you've alluded to our fiscal strategy time and again in your answers, which is planned, credible and transparent investment in our productive infrastructure and our economic resilience. Do you accept that those two things are different?
Look, I'm sorry, Chloe, but I do not accept that a plan that seeks to confiscate tens of billions of dollars of New Zealanders' assets, savings and income in the form of new taxes would be good for the productivity of our economy. I do not accept that burdening the New Zealand economy with tens of billions of more debt on the promise that somehow the Greens would decide that cycleways and light rail are no longer important and that productive investments would be made in the future is credible. I am prepared to concede. At least you have a plan. We don't even know whether Labor want more debt,
No,
more
no,
tax,
Okay.
less spending.
Okay,
So
order.
I'll give you
No.
that.
Thank you, thank you. We're going to go to a supplementary here,
quick
Mr. Stevenson.
Minister,
Mm.
Ms. Fulbright talked about using the government basically balance sheet to invest in infrastructure. Obviously, that's one way. In your budget and over the forward period looking forward, does the government have other policies to actually deliver infrastructure for Kiwis that actually doesn't involve just investment by the government?
Yeah, look, this is a very good point because I do accept the argument, which I think Chloe is making, which is that New Zealand has a need for investment in productive infrastructure and that is a important part of the investment decisions we make. But we also have choices about how we fund that infrastructure. And part of that should be funded by taxpayer funds, by Crown revenue. But part of that can also be funded by the private sector, by levies, by fees for those who benefit from the use of that infrastructure. And the very real example that New Zealand has had under successive governments is that, for example, our electricity transmission infrastructure is in fact funded by electricity users. Our electricity generation infrastructure is funded by the shareholders of electricity generation companies and then in turn by the consumers of electricity. So there are models for providing infrastructure which don't necessarily immediately require the government purse. The question should always be, as I come back to, is this the best marginal use of a taxpayer dollar, and are they the ones that will get the most benefit out of this investment? In some cases, that is really clear. You know, building public health hospitals, building classrooms is a public good for which it's appropriate that the taxpayer fund. But that doesn't mean you get off the hook for making sure that you are making those investments as prudently as possible. You know, one of the achievements of the Education Minister is that she has reduced the average cost of a classroom from over $1.2 million to, I believe at last count, less than $800,000 through using modular builds, off-site construction. That effectively means that the taxpayer purse can go further in terms of the infrastructure it delivers
Okay.
with the public dollar.
Thank you. We're going to have one. We're going to have one sup here, and then we're going to go to sustained questioning by the Honourable Dr. Megan Wood.
So just on that
Ms.
point,
Rob, last one.
On that point of prudence, can you tell me specifically what is prudent about not having a cap on the investment boost policy?
Because what we want to see is the maximum amount of investment and productive assets in this economy to drive productivity and wage growth. And one of the examples that has been raised publicly is, oh my goodness, this might mean that someone comes from overseas and invests in a major manufacturing facility, a major wind farm, and therefore is able to pay less tax on those assets. Well, I say, bring it on. Because if people want to come and make significant investments because of the investment boost policy, investments they wouldn't have otherwise made, then that is the policy.
And just to be clear, that extends to
Last
OM.
one, Chloe.
Yeah, just to be clear, that logic applies to your open door for OMV investing in new oil and gas and fossil fuel.
Yeah.
Because your policy does enable that.
Yeah.
Look, I do want
No,
to be
I will.
clear that that is a matter which I have not been involved in the deliberations and decision making on due to my adherence to the Cabinet Manual. So I'm not the best placed minister to talk to that policy.
But investment boost in particular would allow for OMV, a multinational fossil fuel corporation, to come over here and to get access to effectively that taxpayer subsidised investment.
Well, the advice we had from the IRD is that the way to make this policy the most effective was not to rinky-dink it with exclusions and exceptions, that by having a broad base to the policy, we would have the least distortionary effect on investment choices. The better way to make those choices is through regulation and through the government's rules. And I would put to the member that the decision by the last government to ban offshore oil and gas exploration is one of the most real things that has driven up electricity prices and the cost of living for
takes
every
16
single
years.
New
Right,
Zealander.
we're
And
Order.
you should hang your head in shame about that policy.
Okay, thank you. Order. Can we now go to Dr. Megan Woods, the Honourable?
Thank you. I just have some very specific questions around the money that's been clawed back from pay equity. In particular, the 1.8 billion that has gone into capex. Could the minister please break down what was the capex component of that?
That related to, and I'm just going to speak slowly and invite anyone from the Treasury to correct me if I articulate this wrongly. Essentially, the Treasury had over the forecast period attributed how much it believed would be required for estimated settlements in each of the fiscal years. As the member will be aware, many of those claims had become bogged down and had taken a lot longer
Sorry, Minister,
than,
the
I'm going to get to the answer,
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, than had been anticipated. And in fact, the last government had faced that challenge themselves in terms of the way that the care and support worker claim had been calculated, and it itself had issues with that. And so what that meant was that there was a one-off cost in that fiscal year, which was no longer needing to be met because the settlement hadn't been reached. And so when it comes to one-off costs, that is more akin to capital investment, which is also one-off, rather than a continuating cost into the future, which is an operating cost. Struan, have I done that well enough?
Yes.
Right.
Okay. Thank you. The Minister has said that significant sums, you've said, would be remain to meet potential costs of future pay equities. We noted in the supplementary estimates that there was $419,516 for supporting pay equity and vote health. Is that the retention money for pay equity?
I'm not going to talk about how much money we have put aside for future pay equity settlements. That would compromise the negotiating position of the Crown.
So the $419,516 that is listed on page 464 of the supplementary estimates, what's that for?
I believe that
we can come back. I'm saying it's a claim that's already been settled,
it is.
which is why it's in the supplementary estimates.
Right.
Yeah, so there is $1.8 billion roughly of settlements that have already, on an annualised basis, which the Crown continues to fund.
So how much money is being retained for pay equity settlements?
As I said, I'm not going to share that number with you as it would compromise the negotiating position of the Crown. And I'd note that this was the practice that the government that you were a minister in also took, whereby you did not reveal to New Zealanders that the consequence of your choices had meant that there were billions and billions more being allocated outside operating allowances for potential pay equity settlements. You never revealed those figures to the public because it would have compromised your negotiating position.
Is it your expectation, Minister, in the unfunded sector claims, such as hospice nurses, plunket nurses, those claims that they'll be settled from vote baselines?
What we have agreed as a cabinet is that any future costs from funded sector pay equity settlements, that is to say, members, private sector employers who are found to have systematically undervalued and underpaid their staff per the pay equity legislation, in cases where that is found against private sector employers, we have made a choice that we will not write a blank cheque saying to them that whatever they negotiate, the taxpayer will fund. Instead, what we have said is that we will manage the costs that they may incur and the implications for the Crown from existing baselines or against future budget operating allowances, which makes transparent and visible the trade-offs that would incur, which is to say that if the government decided that it would wear the full cheque for a private sector employer who had underpaid their staff, that we would ask the taxpayer to fund that, that would come at the expense of other investments that could otherwise be made for the taxpayer, be that reducing waiting lists, increasing access to GPs, increasing the availability of emergency care. That is the trade-off that any government will make. So we make that most transparent by doing it through operating allowances and through baselines, rather than pretending that there is a magic pool of money from which no trade-offs are required. That's simply not the case, though we may wish it so.
So just supplementary. So just to clarify, you are confirming that for paying hospice nurses, plunket nurses, what the minister chooses to call the private sector, but just in terms of
some of them are listed on the NZX, Megan. They make pretty good profits.
Hospice nurses, plunket nurses, to pay these workers fairly, we'll see further cuts to baseline funding for health.
No, I absolutely reject that. What we've said is that we have a pay equity regime in law, which we believe is now much clearer and will be much simpler for employees and employers to work through, gives those employers more clarity, means that they can deal with their specific claims rather than being bound into multi-firm claims of up to 90 different employers with very different workforces being joined to one claim, which was creating significant complexity for those individual employers. So on the one hand, we have made the regime clearer and more workable. And on the other hand, we have withdrawn the cabinet underwrite that was introduced in a paper by Chris Hipkins in 2021, which had the effect of saying that anything that was bargained at the table between those private sector employers and employees would be underwritten by the Crown, which resulted in the biggest spike in forecast pay equity costs, many billions of dollars, members, that we've said that that is not a proper assumption to make. Instead, what we must do is that if settlements are reached, and we think that it will affect the delivery of government services, we will choose how we fund that through the normal budget process, which sometimes involves discretionary choices from the operating allowance, sometimes involves reprioritisation with baselines, but is always transparent, upfront, and makes clear to the public the trade-offs that would occur if we were to fund private sector pay equity settlements.
So supplementary, has any money been retained, either as a contingency of its own or a between budget or allowances made in between budget contingencies for any settlements that may occur this year? Or are you saying that if there is going to be direct funding, it would all come from next year's operating allowance?
Well, we have retained funding in a public sector pay equity contingency, which is available for any settlements that are reached where the Crown is the employer. And that is based on Treasury's estimates of what could occur. Of course, the legal obligations on the Crown are binding. So if settlements were to exceed what is in that contingency, the Crown would have to make other choices about how to fund it. However, we have based that contingency on Treasury's best estimates of what it forecasts those costs will be.
Thank you. We're going to go, thank you, Dr. Woods. We're going to go to Ms. Kappa-Kingi, who's online and been very patient.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister Morena, I'd like to ask you some questions, particularly around Māori families, Māori individuals, Māori businesses. So can you just share what specific appropriations or policy initiatives within the Vote Finance, excluding general policy, that address barriers for Māori to access to capital and investments, and what results you think might come from that?
So I think that the member's question is about what are the policies that support Māori, both specifically and in terms of investment?
Yes, specifically Māori, yes. So your any policies, initiatives within the Vote Finance that have a specific attention to Māori business?
Yeah, so one of the consequential things is that both in the health budget, we have specifically ring-fenced funding for Māori health services, which runs into the hundreds of millions. I don't have the figure to hand, but I am happy to provide it to the member subsequent to this meeting. In education, there is a specific Māori education package, which includes funding for additional kura kaupapa and a number of initiatives focused on Māori learners. More generally, the budget prioritises a range of supports for New Zealanders in need of public services, which of course include Māori. The investment boost policy will apply to any Māori entity, be it iwi, hapu, post-settlement entity wishing to make an investment if they fall within those tax rules. And so that is a broad-based policy. And more generally, we continue to provision in the Crown accounts for treaty settlements, which of course are one of the major sources of capital for Māori making investments into the future.
Minister, sorry, just to sup on it, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Yep,
just so if you're at the end of your response, then, if you're referring to the venture capital fund, are there any specific targets within that are dedicated to supporting Māori-owned businesses, Māori-led businesses, Minister?
No, there aren't, but I expect that Māori-led businesses will be both eligible for the scheme and should be able to make sure that they do well, because as you know, there are some incredibly successful Māori-led ventures, and I expect there will be more in the years ahead.
It's just the word should doesn't give me confidence that actually will occur, Minister. It should, and yes, there are successful and driven Māori businesses, but access to that isn't as simple as it sounds, and there's a whole range of reasons why those things can occur. And then you referred to the treaty settlements, and of course that's where Māori, of course, critical to growing our asset base. And so just to that, is there any particular specific attention to that is particular and specific to treaty settlements that will grow, develop, and give better access to Māori in that regard?
Well, a couple of things. First, in terms of, I think you're talking about the Elevate Venture Capital Fund. The Crown has intentionally been a step removed from the individual investment decisions that fund makes. It's actually a fund of funds, so it provides funding to other venture capital funds, which then select which businesses to invest in. So it would be improper for us to direct specifically which businesses we wished those investments to go into. But to the second part of your question about opportunities for post-settlement entities, iwi Māori, I believe that those are significant. Partly, that is because the attitude of the Crown towards investing with iwi is rather expensive. We see a role for iwi increasingly in future being private partners in investment in public infrastructure, and we think that there will be opportunities in that regard. And certainly iwi leaders I have spoken to anticipate those opportunities and are looking forward to them. I also think that there will be particular opportunities for Māori-led entities to partner with the Crown on delivery of both affordable and social housing, partly because some of the restraints that have stopped development on Māori land are regulatory. And this is a government that is prepared to get that red tape out of the way so that Māori can make much better use of their whenua. And you've seen that, for example, in the National Direction Statement, which we've published recently about public kāinga housing, which is intended to be much more enabling of housing development on Māori land. One of the most underutilised assets which New Zealand has is Māori land. And the Crown has both fiscal tools, sure, but regulatory tools are very significant in ensuring that Māori are able to make the use of that capital.
Okay.
One final one, if I may, Mr. Chair. It's really...
Yeah, please.
So how, Minister, how does Treasury monitor Māori economic growth and development? Does it? How does it? Does it keep an eye on it? How does it do that?
Well, you will have seen earlier this year that the Ministry for Business released their snapshot of the Māori economy, which provides a statistical overview of the trends that we are seeing in that part of our economy. It was a really good news story showing increasing rates of Māori entrepreneurship, increasing growth in the Māori capital base, wages between Māori workers and non-Māori workers are getting more even. So there's real success stories across the Māori economy. In fact, by a number of measures, the Māori economy has grown faster than the economy as a whole. And what we've also seen is diversification in that economy, which traditionally has been associated with the primary industries, with fisheries, with forestry. Increasingly, you are seeing that there are a range of other sectors and businesses which are encompassed by the Māori economy, which are doing very well as well. So I am happy to direct you to that report.
Okay. Honourable Sup from Honourable Barbara Evans.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, to your point, yes, the Māori economy is one of the fastest growing sectors in our country. And to your point around unlocking Māori land, in this year's budget, you set aside $5 million in Vote to Māori Development to help unlock that land or do the policy work around that. Yet you chose $23 million for ministerial services travel. Why that choice? $5 million to help unlock Māori land for the fastest growing sector versus 23 million for ministerial travel.
See, this is the difference between you and me. You think you measure your impact by how much you spend. I think we should measure our impact by what we achieve. And I do not share the view that putting double the amount of money into policy advice on that
Thank
matter
you.
would create double the amount of impact.
Okay, thank you. Now, we've got a number of members still on the list. Some haven't asked primary questions. So what we're going to do is ask members to shorten up on the subs, and we're not going to have any cross subs because I want to get back to over this side of the table before 11:30, okay? In the meantime, we're going to go to Miles Anderson.
Morning, Minister. Really enjoying your fulsome answers.
He's due for a promotion, Mr. Chair.
Was consideration given to cutting the company tax instead of putting forward the investment boost policy?
Yes, it was, because we are conscious that at a headline level, New Zealand's rate of corporate tax is now looking pretty high compared to a lot of the countries that we compete for investment with. However, when we compared the impact that a reduction in the headline rate of the corporate tax would have with the impact dollar for dollar we could get through the investment boost policy, the investment boost policy stacked up a lot better in terms of the impact it would have on investment rates, wages and employment creation. And essentially, that's because, of course, a reduction in the headline corporate rate rewards past profits, whereas the investment boost policy specifically targets future investment. So it directly drives the behaviour and activity we want to see.
Supplementary, Ryan Hilden.
Minister, I understood you were at Field Days recently and just before Investment Boost was launched. What was the feedback, from the industry that you heard?
Well, look, fantastic feedback. Thank goodness for the farmers. They are genuinely driving New Zealand's export-led economic recovery, and after many years of hard work are getting very good prices offshore and look to be doing so into the future while also creating good volumes. They've got cash in their pockets, and the investment boost policy is exactly the elbow in the ribcage they need to get spending. And I have had enormous amounts of feedback, both via our MPs and directly from the community, that we've seen an uptick in the purchases of agricultural machinery, and willingness to upgrade technology on farm, of assets on farm. And that's good news. Not only because, of course, it gets cash flowing in the real economy in terms of the businesses from which those purchases are being made, but also because it means that our farmers will continue to be more efficient, productive and profitable into the future. New Zealand's secret sauce in ag is that we have the most productive, most efficient, non-subsidised farmers in the world. And that is a consequence of their choices over successive generations to make investments that allow them to be savvy, very astute farmers, and investment boost policy will support them to continue to be so.
Okay, we're going to go to Chloe Swilbert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When you made changes to KiwiSaver to halve government contributions and to increase the employer and employee contribution rates, did you not set aside funding for the increased cost of the Crown as an employer, as John Key and Bill English did when they made similar changes in 2011?
Well, look, the member has made that claim about what Bill English and John Key did, and it is at odds with the advice that I have had from Treasury. So I am going to if you can just let me pause for a moment while I get to that advice, because it is something that I have been wanting to correct the member on for some time. So I want to be precise in the way in which I do that. Sorry, I've gone to the wrong document.
Is that information publicly available, or are you able to release it?
I'm going to make that information publicly available right now.
Great.
So here we go. So the approach that we have taken, which is that no additional funding is being provided through Budget 25 to agencies to meet the cost of increasing employer contributions for government employees, because agencies in the first instance will be asked to assess what those costs are and then to look at options for meeting those costs within existing baselines. And then we will consider whether any future funding is required to be topped up at the next budget. The advice I have received from Treasury, which I read to you now, this approach is consistent with that taken when KiwiSaver contributions were increased from 2013 through Budget 2011. Agencies were expected to cover KiwiSaver costs from existing baselines.
There was, however, a specific fund that was also set up to address that initial cost, and then it was expected to meet from agency baselines in that 2011.
Well, I am repeating to you the Treasury advice I have received, which is that agencies were expected to cover KiwiSaver costs from existing baselines.
Okay, and I'd love to have the facts printed and happy to engage with the media on that later. I guess to that effect, you have seen those costs or the potential costs reflected in the specific fiscal risks in BFU. And also, if I'm to hear clearly what you're saying and to read between the lines of your answers, both on Radio New Zealand and in what you've just provided to us, effectively, the increased costs of the Crown are to be met by one of three ways. So please correct me if I'm wrong. One is in potential future cuts because they are to be met by agency baselines. The other is an increased cost potentially in the budget next year, or thirdly, in potential wage suppression for public sector employees. Do you accept that? And if not, why?
I accept that the government has choices about how it meets any additional costs that arise because of increasing KiwiSaver contributions to the KiwiSaver funds of New Zealand government employees.
So to that effect, you do accept that it could come at the cost of future wage suppression, at future costs represented in the budget next year, or at other hidden costs or cuts rather to other to agencies and ministries.
The government has made a deliberate policy choice, which is that we want to see New Zealanders given a ready means by which to increase their KiwiSaver balances in retirement. We think it would be wrong to exclude public sector employees from that policy. The government, as an employer, will have to make the same decisions and trade-offs that employers across the country will be making as they work out how they are going to meet those increased contributions to New Zealanders' KiwiSaver funds. The consequence will be this. Overall, the vast majority of New Zealanders who choose to take part in KiwiSaver at the default rate will have far bigger KiwiSaver balances at retirement. 25% bigger, 28% bigger. Many KiwiSavers will also be able to make bigger withdrawals when they go to buy their first home, and the overall pool of KiwiSaver savings able to be invested in the New Zealand economy will also grow over time. I think these are positive things, and I would welcome the members' support for them.
Okay, last up.
Respectfully, did you ask Treasury or officials to do any estimations or ballparking whatsoever as to what the potential increased cost could be to the Crown as an employer under the increase?
Yes, they have done some ballparking, and I can. I want to be careful before I confirm that number because I am not sure how sensitive it is in terms of wage negotiations and collective bargaining. So I would check that before I provide it ad hoc in this committee. But what I can say, it is vastly, vastly smaller than the number you've been bandying about.
Again, those are just based on our estimations because all we
They're
have
wrong.
is the publicly available
Right, well, this
information.
is the
They're wrong.
last
As
question
is
for
your
the day
estimation that you can
for
add
the
billions
session,
to debt and
Ms.
taxes
Rose.
without trashing an economy. That's also wrong.
I am more than happy to debate the.
Okay, right.
Yeah. I mean,
Last question
yeah.
for this session. Thank you.
Respectfully, Mr. Chair. I mean,
Okay,
come
I'm trying to
on. I was
shorten it up. We've got a
patient
long
there.
list of people.
Okay, so I guess just on the ramifications for the broader economy and working people, however, on page 29 of BFU, Treasury outline explicitly, and here I'm quoting, that the economic impact of changes to KiwiSaver, quote, we have assumed that employers will offset the majority, that is 80% of their higher contributions via lower than otherwise wage increases. These lower wage increases have a negative impact on household spending. That is, as a result of the KiwiSaver changes that you have made, there will be less household spending stimulating the economy.
Well, look, that was a feature of the analysis that Michael Cullen gave when he first introduced the policy. He acknowledged transparently and openly that these were trade-offs that would occur within employment negotiations, and that is the case. However, it would be wrong to consider the impacts of the KiwiSaver policy in isolation, because offsetting that policy, we also had in our budget investment boost and a number of other growth-enhancing initiatives, which on the margin will have positive impacts on both wage growth, household consumption and GDP growth. And so it is appropriate, I think, to look at it as a whole rather than to isolate one particular policy.
Sorry,
Okay,
just
we're gonna
just
go
to be
to Dan
crystal
Bidwell,
clear
who
on
hasn't
that.
even had a primary.
Just to be crystal clear on that, actually,
Well-
my understanding of the analysis from officials is that investment boosts can contribute towards GDP growth, but can you point us specifically to where that says that we will have wage growth as a result as well?
Yes, that is specific and it's in the documents we released on budget day. The effect on wage growth is expected to be 1.5% over a 20-year period, with at least half of that front-loaded into the first 5 years. In fact, in the regulatory impact statement, which is available to the member, the IRD make clear that they expect the beneficiaries of the investment boost policy to be New Zealand workers, both through increased employment opportunities and wage increases, that the benefits of the policy will be very broadly spread throughout the economy. The impact on wage growth, it is very easy to understand, which is when a business is more productive due to higher rates of capital intensity, it is better able to pay its workers more. That is a significant factor in those economies who do pay their workers more. They are more capital intensive, they are more productive, they have higher paid workers. That's exactly what we want to achieve and was a huge driver behind our introduction of the investment boost policy.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go to the member for Northcote, Dan Bidwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do just want to echo my acknowledgement of you, Dominic Stevens. Thank you for your work on the long-term insights briefing, and we'll see you back in Birkenhead. Look, Minister, I'd like to talk to you about in the BFU, you had a new fiscal sensitivity analysis. And, you know, I guess a month is a long time. So I'm just keen to get a sense from you around why we've introduced this to BFU and if you could talk us through it. I know it's very uncertain times for forecasters.
Sorry, Mr. Chair.
We can do this. when we
Okay,
have
well, if the
Treasury.
minister's prepared to answer it.
I'm happy to address that in my
We
answer.
had a
if you
session
like,
with
Deborah.
Treasury.
Yep. If you're happy to answer, then please.
Dan, very happy to pick that up. So there are two different things that occur. The first is in the fiscal strategy report, which is the document I own, as it were, or I sign it out. We have made a deliberate choice to, rather than provide one set of projection scenarios into the future, to provide multiple scenarios for different scenarios. And the reason that we have done that is to make visible what different choices around operating and capital allowances and spending into the future can have on the fiscal track. And I think that that is a helpful development. The second thing is, as you report, the Treasury in their document, which is the BFU, the one that they own, and while former ministers of finance may have tried to manipulate it, I've resisted the urge. In that document,
Okay,
there are
order.
sensitivity analysis has traditionally been done to acknowledge the fact that there are always upside and downside risks to the growth trajectory, which then, of course, have fiscal implications. And in the world as we are in now, I think we should all be very conscious of that, which is there are missiles flying across the Middle East. We have
This should only
trade
go so long, Mr. Chair.
negotiations happening with ramifications beyond which I have previously experienced in my career. We have a global economy that is volatile. And so it is appropriate that at this juncture, I believe a New Zealand government should make very prudent choices fiscally, given the potential downside risks that exist. And I do want to leave members with this. Those who think that the heydays are here and we should go on a big spend up need to remember that that is exactly what people thought over the past 6 years. And it left us in a position with huge indebtedness, structural deficits, and a cost of living crisis. Over these next few years, we cannot shape the decisions that world leaders will make. New Zealand will have to react to that. I believe it's my responsibility to ensure that we are making the most prudent choices now to position us strongly for that future.
Thank you, Mr.
Okay, yep,
One more,
right.
Mr. Chair.
One more from Mr. Bidwell.
Thank you, Minister. Could you explain some of these downside risks for the fiscal forecast? So, you know, particularly if inflation picks up again or if interest rates, you know, go the way they're tracking, what's the impact on the government's books for such downside scenarios?
Yeah, look, I'm happy to let Struan speak to the detail of that. But what I would say is broadly that if there was a downturn in the growth trajectory of our trading partners, that would have an impact both on our terms of trade, the export prices that we got, and therefore levels of growth and investment in the broader economy, which essentially translates to two things. One, less tax revenue to spend than we're projecting. But two, the other corollary that's often forgotten is higher costs for the government, both in terms of the interest cost on the additional borrowing we would need to do, but potentially also the higher welfare costs where you get lower levels of employment and therefore need to provide more support to more New Zealanders of working age. So that's significant. Of course, increases in global inflation can translate through to New Zealand's inflation rates. And if inflation is higher than we're predicting. That can cause the Reserve Bank to have to impose higher interest rates than it would otherwise be forecasting, which, all things being equal, has a negative impact on economic activity, therefore, again, reducing rates of revenue. So there are a number of factors that can affect the forecasts that have flow through to both the economic outlook and the fiscals, which is why it is so important that where the government has discretionary choices, we make choices that are in favour of prudence and that are in favour of growth.
Okay, thank you. We're now going to, no more supplementaries. We'll come back to you if we've got time. We're going to the Honourable Barbara Edmonds.
You promised 240,000 more jobs. Are these new jobs from the budget or just the natural result of more people living here in New Zealand?
We're using the same forecast successive ministers of finance have, which is that the Treasury project how many jobs will be created over the forecast period, and that number is 240,000.
So how can you promise 240,000 new jobs when your first move was actually to cut thousands of existing ones and to slow down infrastructure spend, which saw a loss of 15,000 construction sector jobs?
I'm not quite sure what the member's point is. We are projecting that over the next 4 years, as a result of economic growth in New Zealand, 240,000 additional jobs will be created. The point that I would make to the member is that if your job creation strategy is simply hiring more public servants, then I would suggest to you that that is not a highway to productivity or real growth for New Zealand. I would also put to you that we have continued to make billions of dollars worth of investments in infrastructure, including commitments to roads of national significance, $1 billion in this budget committed to health infrastructure, hundreds of millions committed to school property, millions committed to new corrections facilities. We believe that there is a significant role for the Crown in investing in public infrastructure, but that does not get us off the hook for also ensuring that when we make those investments, we make them carefully and ensure maximum value for taxpayer funds.
Okay, supplementary.
So you say that the 240,000 new jobs is from economic growth. Treasury says it's from population growth. Who was right?
Well, population growth also has an impact on economic growth, so they are sides of the same coin.
Okay, another primary will go to the Honourable Dr. Deborah Russell.
I want to just dig into the partial expensing a bit. And as you know, it's a policy where both Barbara and I both said that something needs to be done in this space. So whether or not it was this particular policy is one of those things, but something in this space.
Oh, but I'd heard Barbara on the radio. She said that it was her favourite thing in the budget. So
it was one of the few
favourites. But
Everything's relative.
what I want to know is just some of the ways that this policy is going to be measured. So, because we're concerned that there is the potential for a cost blowout in it, I will see. So I just want to know how you're actually measuring the actual cost of the policy over the next few years.
Yeah, well, look, it's a really interesting question. Because, of course, the member understands that it is very difficult to understand which investments took place because of the policy and which investments would have taken place
so the deadweight cost.
Otherwise. Yep. And so really all that inland revenue will understand is how much tax revenue it's collecting and how that varies from its forecasts. And of course, a number of factors will have a bearing on that in terms of growth rates, productivity rates, profitability rates. And so measuring the impact of the policy in a really specific sense will be challenging. But what we can do is have information from firms about investments that they are able to inform us that they have brought forward. And what we are able to get directly is how many cases in which the investment boost deduction has been applied to a business's set of accounts. So that is information that I have asked IRD to collect, and they are going to provide me advice about the format in which that advice can come. But I am just communicating clearly to the member that there are some limitations in us working out what the impact of the policy is versus what would have happened otherwise.
So let me just clarify, Minister, because I think I'm happy with what you said. You said can't quite disaggregate some of the impacts of the policy, but you are going to ask inland revenue to measure how much people are claiming with the partial expensing.
Well,
you're looking at the accounts that people submit.
So what I have recently asked inland revenue for is what is the series of data that I can monitor that will give me some concrete information. So one of the things that they can do is when they are looking at tax returns, how many times the investment boost deduction is applied in those returns.
So it's a separate deduction.
Because there is, of
from-
course, a choice about whether or not people apply that deduction
Okay.
on top of their existing depreciation. So, for example, loss-making businesses may not choose to use it in that loss-making year and to instead bring it into a future year. So we can look at that data and therefore what I expect, but haven't yet had the provisional report, is that we will be able to get some sense of the value of those deductions.
Minister, I appreciate that you personally can't comment on the petroleum thing in there. And this was canvassed a little before, but one of the things I'm concerned about is that some of that, it's the deadweight cost, really, of the policy. So there was investment that would have happened anyway that is now going to be subsidised, given that extra boost along. But there's also just people upgrading existing assets when they've got stuff that could have perfectly well done the job. So what advice were you given around that in terms of actually getting new and fresh investment and increasing capital intensity rather than just replacing existing assets?
Well, the advice was very clear that it would lead to investment happening that wouldn't have otherwise happened and investment being brought forward that would otherwise have been delayed. I guess the other way to think about this is somewhat philosophical, which is, let's say someone was going to invest this year in a new factory, regardless of whether or not investment boost came along. Does that mean that the investment boost policy shouldn't be applied? My view is actually for that business, what it means is that this year in which they're making that investment, they're going to have far greater cash flow than it would have otherwise been the case as a result of this tax deduction. In my view, is that with that greater cash flow, that business may then decide to hire a few more workers, to give a bigger pay increase than they may have otherwise made, to consider the next round of automation investments in their factory that they may not otherwise done. So to me, it works both ways, both incentivising investment that wouldn't have otherwise happened, but also providing greater cash flows to firms that are making investments, which has positive impacts for the economy as a whole.
A little bit of analysis is why we, without necessarily agreeing on every detail of this particular policy, we sort of go, yes, about some of the stuff that ought to have happened. I am, though, puzzled as to why it was applied to commercial buildings as well, rather than, say, much more targeting towards some of that automation, those immediately productive assets. And as I said, I appreciate you can't comment on the fossil fuel stuff.
Yeah, look, the advice broadly that we received, and this was a point that we considered, was that if you start excluding particular types of investment from the deduction, then you do distort investment choices across the economy. And it is conceivable that a commercial property investment, be that a factory or a new facility in which business is going to occur, will be very consistent with that business improving its growth trajectory and its productivity trajectory. And if we were to exclude that class of investment, we could in fact have quite a distortionary effect, which would be to stop people making those investments which are necessary to firms' growth.
The puzzle I have there is that commercial buildings aren't depreciable.
That's correct.
So, why then give them?
Well, in the absence of this policy, that distortion would become greater.
Okay.
Thank you.
We're going to go to Jamie Arbuckle.
Thank you, Minister. The government's got a real growth agenda, and we, like the government's looking at the export sector in particular. And on my travels out in the horticultural space, things like zestfruit and looking at kiwi fruit and the innovation that's happening. And they're talking about doubling returns, and you can actually see it happening because they've got the innovation with red kiwi fruit, the gold, and they've got the products there.
Did you try that new red one at Field Days? Delicious.
You also got like Aotearoa where prices are high, like the returns to farmers are good. You got things like aquaculture where policy changes are allowing people to get on, put more mussels, more oysters, and actually trying to get more returns. So what does that actually mean for our books if money comes in sooner? What does that mean for debt repayments? What does it mean for infrastructure and stuff if the books actually turn around quicker?
Yeah, look, very simply, New Zealand can't get rich selling to itself. We're a small trading nation. When we are able to sell more offshore for better prices, that means more income for New Zealanders and more growth opportunities for our country. And that's why our government is so focused on driving an export-led recovery with a goal to double the value of exports by 2034, and why we're so pleased to see the revival that you're talking about and the fortunes of our primary producers in particular. And there are things that the government can do to support that export growth. Taking the example of kiwi fruit, one of the major constraints on growth in that industry in recent years has related to their ability to have the people to process kiwi fruit at harvest. And what you saw was major quality concerns emerging, providing constraints to their customer relationships and expansion opportunities because they simply couldn't get the hands to do all of the quality control that was needed. Our adjustments to the REC scheme have meant that that constraint in terms of workers has now been removed from that industry, and you're seeing it flourish. Equally, every time we say let's slap another piece of red tape on our farmers in terms of the environmental regulation that they face, that's an hour or more at the kitchen table dealing with that red tape rather than thinking about how do I drive the productivity and efficiency of my farm. So we as a government every day, every week are thinking about what can we do to get out of the way of exporters, make it easier for them to succeed and provide them the supports they need to flourish in offshore markets. And I had a great hour with the Foreign Affairs Select Committee yesterday talking about the work of NZTE and MFAT in that regard.
Okay, we're down to the last 11 minutes. We're going to go back to the Honourable Dr. Deborah Russell.
Thank you. Minister, page 63 of Vote Finance, this one, and we have 180 million going to community housing providers via a financing thing. How many houses will that provide?
Not quite right in terms of the way that you're describing that. That is essentially, because it's not Crown funding that is going directly in, right. It's essentially a Crown underwrite to get up and running a Crown lending scheme so that community housing providers are able to access cheaper finance than would otherwise be the case, because one of the barriers that we have identified to community housing providers being able to deliver affordable and social housing is their access to affordable lending. And so that scheme is not necessarily a direct cost over the long term, but is an underwrite of a guarantee scheme. And I've been very pleased to see that the major commercial banks have responded well to that and expect to take part in the scheme. Over the forecast period, we are expecting to deliver thousands of additional income-related rent subsidised homes. But we also have a mind to how many affordable homes that we can create. So that is homes which aren't necessarily eligible for an income-related rent subsidy, but are delivered potentially by social housing providers or others in a way that allows for lower rents than would otherwise be the case.
I get all that. Nevertheless, how many houses, the critical measure of this is how many people get housed.
Well, I'm happy to go and look at what the estimates are for how much additional housing will be provided as that scheme. But of course, I would just note that there will be limitations on those estimates based on fundamentally what the uptake of the scheme is. The two success indicators for me were the scheme won't work unless the commercial banks like it and get on board. And as I say, very positive to receive affirmation from the major commercial banks that they want to take part in the scheme and that they see that it will be useful in reducing their cost of lending and increasing their appetite to lend to the sector. The second point, of course, is what the appetite of individual community housing providers is to take on more debt as a consequence of the scheme. And of course, while I can see whether we have an estimate of that, it would only ever be an estimate.
Supplementary, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I was just going to ask, so what were the assumptions that was part of that estimate? Like what did Treasury use to actually forecast that figure? What were your assumptions?
Well, essentially the problem definition that we have had is that community housing providers for some years have reported that they find it harder to access commercial lending for a couple of reasons. One is about the nature of the government contracts that they get for income-related rents or subsidies for the social housing that they provide, and the sense of how long dated those contracts are and whether they're up for grabs year to year, and therefore whether they should be confirmed as an income stream when banks are making lending decisions. And second is around the risk ratio that commercial banks put on this as an asset class. And so what community housing providers have argued for some time is that they pay a penal rate on the interest rate on their debt as a consequence of those two things. So the question we asked ourselves as ministers is, what role can the Crown provide in providing more surety to those doing commercial lending, that this is an asset class in which the government will have an ongoing concern, and therefore there isn't going to be the level of risk that is currently being priced in. And second, what can we do to underwrite that to some extent so that the lending is getting out the door in greater quantums? And so the scheme that we have developed is directly intended to reduce the cost of lending to community housing providers under what it would have otherwise been.
But that's the principle, but what's the assumptions that Treasury use to get to that figure? Because is it a risk ratio of $1 for dollar, so a dollar investment?
I'm happy to provide the members some more briefing on that and answer the written questions.
Okay.
I just have a supplement too.
Dr. Woods.
Did you receive advice around actually just continuing to offer 15, 20-year income-related rent subsidy contracts with community housing providers would actually provide the banks with that level of surety for the CHIPS to be able to borrow?
Oh, look, that's all part of the thinking too, and you're probably best placed to address those questions to the Minister of Housing.
Okay, but will you provide an answer to the subset that Barbara's just been answered? Any advice you've got about that?
Look, really happy to provide you additional information on the scheme. I have to say it has been absolutely applauded and welcomed by the community housing sector, a sector our government wants to see grow and thrive, a sector who have delivered housing with more efficiency than Aotearoa even dreamed of during your time as Minister, and a sector that provides very bespoke and tailored services to their tenants.
Given that,
Okay, we're going to have a sup. We'll have a sup.
So, Minister, what we're just wanting to understand is whether you're needing to provide this lending because your government is failing to provide the increases in income-related rent subsidy places that would be required for the CHIPS to have the surety to go and build. Because I would note, Minister, that actually the CHIPS built more houses under our government than any government that of any time, including your own. You have 500 places in this year's budget, and they're all in Auckland.
No, Minister, former Minister.
You're the Minister.
Yeah, member, I can confirm for you that this policy is intended to be a very strong signal that our government backs community housing providers. And let me tell you, when they're behind closed doors with me, they don't feel that that was necessarily always the case with you.
Okay. Okay, we're going to go on to close for a sup, or we're down to the quickfire session now.
Yeah, so are we to take it from your fiscal strategy, your general rhetoric, and your answers today that you believe that growth will trickle down? And if so, what are you basing that belief upon, if not 40 years of evidence and experience that shows the opposite?
Well, what I believe is that those countries which have wealthier economies are able to pay their people more, have more resources available to invest in public service provision, to protect the environment, to deliver social outcomes, that countries that are wealthier provide their people better choices. And the most obvious example of this, and it must be raised with you as it is raised with me, is when someone says, I think my child is going to get paid more in Australia. I say to them, you know what? That is why it is so critical that we focus on growth, because fundamentally Australia is about 30% richer than us, and richer countries pay their workers more. And I'm not prepared to settle back and just say, let's let New Zealand allow ourselves to be a poorer country that pays people less, that has less money to invest in public services. Let's be ambitious and aspirational for growth, and let's not put our recovery at risk by saddling this economy with billions more in taxes and debt, as you would do.
Well, just to be clear, Australia does have a higher income tax rate, a form of the capital gains tax, better union bargaining and other ways, but besides the point. What intentional new redistributional policies have you implemented in your time as Minister of Finance that would go against...
One of the most regressive things that occurred under the last government.
That would go against the understanding that we can take from all of your answers today that you are simply hoping that growth trickles down.
Okay. So 3 key things. Three key regressive policies that the last government did. One,
Again,
allowed inflation to
Your
soar out of
budget.
control. Inflation harms the poorest most who have the fewest choices.
Tradable inflation
Okay,
to
quiet.
Allowed for
international.
bracket
Order.
creep in our
Order.
progressive
Reason
income
that
tax
you
system,
say
Order.
which meant that lower
hindering
income
your
workers
growth.
were paying a bigger proportion of their wage
Again,
in
the
tax.
minister needs to stick to the
Three,
question.
allowing for public
the chair
spending
should.
to occur in ways that didn't deliver an efficiency dividend. Those dollars would have been
More than
better
happy to
kept
cut all
in
the
those
ribbons,
low-income
all the
households.
Okay.
If I
And-
may, hospitals.
And Mr.
Just
Chair,
quiet, please.
our choice to adjust tax brackets delivered benefits to lower and middle income working people. Our choice to adjust working for families entitlements delivered benefits to lower and middle income people. And any government that chooses to let inflation get out of control and bracket creep to be the way that it funds its extravagant promises is punishing
One more
the
question.
poor for its bad
Okay,
fiscal
thank
Hear the
management.
meeting.
Okay, order.
Again, yeah, just to be clear, my question was about what
Look
you
at it,
had
it's all
done
boys.
as minister and
All boys.
the income
Yeah.
tax changes that you yourself referenced.
Sorry,
The
point of
official-
order.
No,
I'm sorry, point of order. The opposite members making sexist remarks across
Yes.
there. I think they would have learned from yesterday just to tone
talking
it
to each
down,
other.
behave
I
properly.
just
and
want to
we'll
talk
let-
about the economy.
Yes,
Can we
thank
please
you.
do
We'll let
that?
Ms. Fulbright
Look, can we just
answer
do the
that
last
question.
order? Can we just do the last 3 minutes? We've been so good, haven't we? Can we just do the last
Debatable.
3 minutes in silence, other than the questioner and the answer?
Thank you. So just to be crystal clear, I mean, the official advice that you received on your income tax changes did show that the majority of the material benefit is going to aggregate to the top 40% of households. So I just wanted to address that point. But just to be crystal clear, in my answer before, you only referred to the former government. My question was to you, what, as Minister of Finance, have you done in your tenure to intentionally address growing inequality?
Focused very hard on making sure inflation is under control, the most regressive tax there can be on working people and low-income people. Ensured that we are supporting policies which drive growth and therefore job creation and income
So
growth.
trickle down.
And
Yep.
I would put to you that when you do bracket adjustment, what you ensure is that people on lower levels of income pay less tax. And it is the fact that a significant proportion of households overall are recipients of funding from the Crown rather than net taxpayers. And so it is more difficult to impact them through that tax system. But our changes to working for families, our changes to Family Boost have ensured that a number of low-income families facing high costs have received additional income. Our adjustments to the Super Gold scheme for the rates rebates have ensured that a number of low-income households will get additional income. Our policies are targeted. I'll tell you one thing that doesn't solve poverty. What doesn't solve poverty is making countries poorer. If you want to solve poverty, the answer to poverty is wealth. You have to create wealth to create less poverty.
Yeah,
And
through
so
productive
your
investment.
approach of saying, let's divide the pie into ever smaller pieces and hope that it doesn't bleed out is wrong and has been proven time and time again throughout history. And I reckon New Zealanders know it. And the question is just when Labor will admit they're on the same page.
Okay, okay.
Come on.
Right,
That's
now,
not
if
what
we
I
can-
said.
thank
And
you.
that's not what the Green
Thank
policy
you.
We're
is.
going to go to order. Order.
just
We're going to go to the last question, the last 30 seconds. It's going to be a short question and a short answer.
Thank you,
Deputy Chair.
Minister.
Thank
for
Thank you.
having the last 2 hours. It's been quite a comprehensive discussion and what looks to be a very well-balanced budget. I guess my question would be, what do you think New Zealanders could be
Harder.
most proud of with this budget?
I think New Zealanders can be proud of the fact that after an incredibly tough few years economically for many people, in terms of their cost of living, in terms of our businesses, that they have got through that period and that they can now look forward to recovery. And that is actually through their own effort and their own hard work, that many New Zealanders have made sacrifices, but they have held on. And that means that the government is now in a position where we can forecast ongoing real wage growth, ongoing job creation, ongoing improvements to their cost of living. And that doesn't happen because a government decided that we would spray the money hose around and spend their money on them better than they could spend themselves. That happens because we put our faith in New Zealanders and their firms to make investments, to grow this economy, to do the work. And we're an economy we are a government that will stand by them while they make those choices. And as a result, they can look forward to better living standards in the next few years.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to our Minister of Finance and Minister for Economic Growth. Thank you also to Mr. Rennie and to Mr. Little as well, and to all officials here, particularly from Treasury. Thank you also, members. I think that was a very good 2-hour interaction. So thank you for your time, Minister.
Thank you.
Thank you. We will reconvene, members. We break now. We will reconvene for the Budget, Economic and Fiscal Update 2025 at 12:45. So you've got 75 minutes. Thank you.